Hello, my name is Pádraig Ó Tuama, and I'm delighted to be with Maggie Burton, author of Griffin Prize-winning book Chores, published by Breakwater Books. Maggie, congratulations.
Thank you so much.
You got the news on your birthday, am I right?
I did, yeah. It was my 33rd birthday. It was the best birthday
Oh,
gift I've ever
well,
received.
yeah, that's a pretty good. What did you do for the rest of the day? Did it get better?
I went shopping and bought a pair of shoes. So,
Yeah, that's the kind of thing that you can do with prize-winning money, buying
that's
shoes.
right, yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah. The judges awarded your book the Canadian First Book Prize, and from the judges, they said the book's detailed, intimate awareness beautifully evokes Newfoundland and expands to our worldwide cultural moment. There's two strands within that, really. One about place, and the other about voice. I wonder if you could speak about place first in your writing.
Yes, so I did grow up in rural Newfoundland. My town had about 600 people in it, so it was really small. And although it was only about an hour outside of St. John's, we never really went to St. John's. So it was basically like growing up in an outport community. And I was born in 1991, which was just around the time the cod moratorium was put in place. So it was an extremely economically depressed time. So a few years before I was born, the town would have been like much larger in terms of its population. But around my childhood, all of the towns in the Conception Bay area where I grew up were very depopulated because everybody moved to Toronto or Alberta to work. So it was a very strange time that sort of felt ahistorical in a certain way. So I was very close with all of my extended family members, and all of us were very poor. And it really felt like a childhood that could have been placed in the 19th century as opposed to the 20th. So it really, as an adult, it really inspired me, as I started having my own kids and things like that, to think about my childhood and how strange it was. So I think place played a very big role in that.
Yeah. And then they also praised the book's voice to our worldwide cultural moment. I mean, obviously, those are their words, but I'm curious how those words land for you.
So I certainly think of myself as writing in a bit of a Newfoundland vernacular. So, I try to use as many Newfoundland sayings and turns of phrase as I can that sort of evoke a sense of place through the voice. But I also, yeah, I try to be direct, accessible. If somebody is not really into poetry, I want them to be able to pick up my book and read a poem and understand it and make sense of it right away. So I do play some word games, but uh, they're not complicated. It's all very simple and direct. So I think that's the
Yeah.
strength of my voice in a nutshell.
Mm, mm. I wonder if you could read the poem Clay Pipes.
Sure. I wrote when in my backyard there was a lot of clay pipes when we were digging up the soil everywhere, because it used to be a forge, like where my house was. So we often find these 18th century pipes, which was really cool. Clay pipes. I wanted to be an archaeologist. The holes in my backyard were dug by me. I roped off sections of my mother's flower beds, destroyed daffodil bulbs, cut worms in half, displaced migratory snails, catalogued every little piece of clay, bone, plates. I wanted to know whose it was. My father explained there was a forge here, as if fire could account for all of this. I glued a pipe back together, made a new glass, appeared almost whole. I brought it to my lips, and my lungs tried on an ashy coat like my ancestors. Fishing men or kneeling women bent backs over potato beds, over mounds of capelin, digging in for winter.
I mean, obviously, not every speaker of every poem is autobiographical. In fact, some of them definitely aren't. But when I read the book, I really felt like I think this one might be relatively close to yourself. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah. A lot of
Yeah.
the childhood stuff especially is pretty direct.
Yeah. What were you like as a child?
Um, I was very playful. Definitely very outgoing, had a lot of friends, but also spent a lot of time alone in the woods. We grew up on this like a family lane, and there was a huge hill behind the house, and I spent most of my time just sort of feral during the
Mm.
days, and had a lot of freedom. So I did whatever I felt like all the time, especially during the summers. And I lived next door to my grandparents, so
Mm.
I grew up, I'd say, half the time in their house and half the time in mine. And
Yeah.
yeah, so I spent a lot of time just in nature, in the woods there, just in my own
Mm.
imagination.
There's such a strong sense of time in this, wanting to be an archaeologist and also wanting the physical sensation of the ash from ancestors' lungs in your own lung as well. Um, what is it about time and connection? Obviously, you live next door to your grandparents. In what way, in what other ways did that show up for you as a child?
I was very interested in history, so I went to music school, but I did a music history degree. So I've always been
Mm.
yeah, very interested in history as a way to understand the present. Brigus was a very historical community, so it was founded in the early 17th century, and things like we did a lot of heritage fairs and other projects as children to connect with the past, and I always took it very seriously. So Brigus was burned once by the French by Pierre Le Moyne d'Iberville in the late 17th century, and it was learning things like that, like picturing these old men rampaging through the town lighting everything on fire, really freaked me out. So I spent a lot of time, yeah, like thinking about the past and wanting to understand it, and reading a lot of nonfiction. And yeah, we
Mm.
had we had the typical encyclopedia set where I'd read it all, and
Yeah.
I was really interested in archaeology as a way to understand the past. Yeah, I was pretty obsessed with Mayan peoples and Egyptian culture and things like that, like as a child.
Yeah. Mm. The second stanza of that poem you just read, Clay Pipes, speaks about destroyed daffodil bulbs, cut worms in half, and then goes on to displaced migratory snails. These are very strong verbs. Um, Destroyed, cut, displaced. What are you doing by employing those verbs?
Yeah, so the violence of history is something that's really that strikes me. Things like I just mentioned about like Brigus being burnt down, or you know, I like to consider like intimate partner violence, other types of violence that we sort of the everydayness of it is very upsetting to me. And I tried
Mm.
in this book, I tried to sort of weave that through a little bit in the word choice. But yeah, like the idea of a human being sort of going out there and digging up the soil and having no regard for the sort of living creatures that are under there. Even now, like I'm working in my flower gardens, and I'm very careful not to disturb too deep in the soil because I know there are a lot of earthworms in my garden, and I don't want to destroy their little
Yeah.
tunnels. So
Mm.
I definitely didn't think about that as a child, that I was destroying things. But looking back on it, the act of digging things up and exhuming them seemed very violent to me, which serves as a metaphor for other types of sort of daily violence.
Yeah. You use a composite character, particularly in the first part of the book, this composite character of Nan. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your choice of that, and a little bit about the real Nans as well.
Yeah, so the Nan character was my. So I have one Nan right now who's alive. Her name is Tina, and a lot of these poems, like the Chores poem, the titular poem, is very much about her. But a lot of the other poems are more combined versions of all my grandmothers. So I grew up. I had four great grandmothers that were alive and two grandmothers, and my nan had all these sisters, and we were really close with all of them. So I grew up with a lot of really interesting women who were all homemakers. Like there was nobody worked. Everybody was at home, and so I spent a lot of time sort of shadowing them and doing making bread and and soup and things like that all the time. So yeah, I found them really inspiring once I had my own children, and I totally sucked at doing housework. Like I thought it was so bad. I had my son. I was 20 when he was born. I was 19 when I got pregnant, and I decided to keep the baby partly because, well, I know how to do this because I did it my whole life. I was always babysitting my younger cousins, shadowing my grandparents, my mom, my nans, and yeah, but the housework totally it just eluded my abilities. Like I was not cut out for it at all. Anyway, I realized how hard they worked and how impressive it was that they were able to do all that. So I wanted to pay homage to them a little bit, in terms of in writing about them, because I don't think many people um, have written poems about their nans in this sort of way. So I really wanted to try to do
Yeah.
something a little bit special for them.
Hmm. I wonder if you could read a few of the sections of the title poem "Chores." There's multiple sections in it, but it was the first two that I was really interested in hearing you talk about. But you can choose another few as well.
Yep. So chores number one. Pop snared rabbit, our early morning catch. The woods were teeming. I expected its breath to smell like hops, whiskers to twitch, eyes to be red, but they were just brown, stale. Nan skinned rabbit in the kitchen sink. While she worked, I eyed the walls, wondering about the fingerprints always appearing out of nowhere, as if leaking out from inside the old wood. Soot black, sticky as molasses, they mocked us. No matter what she tried, they would never come off. Her fingers dug in hard, long rabbit legs splayed open, skin peeling off muscle. I watched its body flutter toward the sink's cold edge, bouncing off the sides, blood settling in under Nan's nails. I chucked the leftovers to the crows. What else was there to do?
So, what else was there to do?
I suppose not kill the rabbits. I was really upset by hunting and by snaring rabbits and other wild game, a trout or whatever have you, and yeah, I felt very complicit in it, like just being there. My yeah, my pop got me. He showed up one day with two rabbits in a cage, like they were wild rabbits, and they were to be my pets. And so we set up a rabbit hutch outside, and they dug their way out and got back into the woods. And then I imagined every time that we ate rabbit after that, I imagined that it was those rabbits. So it was
Oh,
very upsetting to me,
yeah,
and I sort of wanted to in the first poem, I sort of wanted to condemn my pop a little bit for the violence of catching the rabbits, right? So and I expected its breath to smell like hops, eyes to be red, but they were just brown, stale. I meant for that to be a bit of a call out to alcoholism and drinking, right? So
yeah,
that was me trying to have a dig
yeah.
at him.
um, there's a lot of attention to the body throughout the book, but I was really struck by the attention to the body of skinning, of blood under the nails, of labor. And then later, elsewhere in the book, there's a lot of attention to the erotics of the body, particularly the female body, and then also attention to violence towards the female body, too.
Mhm.
What is the interest for you in the body and bringing the body out through so many of these chores, but not just describing the chores, also describing the body at work?
So growing up, the women that I knew all told me a lot of stories about violence, about domestic violence and sexual violence, and it was just sort of accepted and very common and part of life, right? So, we had stories about cousins who would hide out in our basement for a few days at a time until their husband blew off steam, whatever was going on, sort of passed over. He got sober, stopped looking for her, so these things were very normalized. And when I became an adult, I had a really traumatic intimate partner violence couple of years, of regular unpleasant experiences. So, and it was so normalized that I never really noticed what was happening until I sort of had a bit of distance from it. So I was pretty upset about that, and felt a lot of connection with my ancestors who, many of whom had husbands who were abusive or, um, at best absent, but at worst present, right? So there was,
Mm.
yeah, a lot of thinking about that, and especially in this economic downturn of the 1990s, all these men were unemployed and everybody was an alcoholic. And I remember being very upset about my father and some of the things that he had done. And my mother sat me down and listed off all of my friends' dads, and their sort of ill deeds that everyone knew about. Of course, I didn't know about it because I was a child, but it was it was extremely comforting to know that we were not unique in that way, but also
Mm.
horrifying to see the everyday acceptance of domestic violence. And it was all, it's all about the female body, so it's all directed towards women.
Yeah. You work as a city council. You work as a city councillor in St. John's, and it seems to me that one of your professional interests is, improving lives for people through that work. And I wonder how that spills over, or whether it does, to your writing. Do you have a hope that the poems in Chores and other things you write too can do some work beyond the page?
Oh, certainly. I really want people to see themselves in, especially for Newfoundland women, to see themselves in my work. And there's definitely a theme throughout the book of a triumph over evil. Like there's the women sort of rise above what they're doing. They confront their partners. They end up in a house alone, and the freedom of life without oppression is a big theme in the book. So in the bingo poem, the middle square of each bingo set is a free space, and I wanted to really highlight the importance of freedom and give people hope who were perhaps stuck in relationships or in situations in general that were oppressive and problematic. And yeah, in my work as a politician, I try to I focus most of my energy on equity work. Trying to make the city a more you know equitable place, the built environment, the natural environment, but also a lot of poverty reduction efforts. And I got involved because of wanting to improve people's lives, and I think I've had a lot of success there. And I hope that in my poetry too, that
Yeah,
people see something that they can improve their lives with.
yeah, yeah. You mentioned the bingo poem there. I was struck by the form of that poem. I wonder if you could talk a bit about the form, but also then one of the deeper messages of bingo is that mix between hope and chance and good luck and bad luck and opportunities missed and coming close to and envy when somebody wins. I thought that was a very interesting way to talk about people's lives within the context of framing and shaping the poem the way you do.
When I was a child, every Friday night we would go to bingo. So all the nans would, go out, and that was, as I saw, that was the only opportunity they ever took to get out of the house. So it was either that or Sunday dinner, and cards when everybody would get together. But it was always centered around gambling. So whether it was cards, even though there might not have been any money at stake, it was still the idea of wanting to win
Sure.
a game, win a hand of scat
Mm.
or hearts or something like that. And yeah, going to bingo was a very formative experience. And when I was little, you had one half of the room was for smoking section, and the other half of the room was a non-smoking section. But of course, the smoke was everywhere.
Yeah, there's
And
no such thing as a non-smoking
so
section.
I found that by the time I graduated from high school, I had pre-emphysema. So, and I never
Mm.
smoked. I was not a smoker, so it was very,
Same. Yeah.
yeah. So the smoking was a main part of that poem for sure. I wanted to sort of discuss the impulse to try to make my family stop smoking and quit smoking throughout this book. Like that was one of I was sure as a child that everybody was just going to die one day because of cigarettes.
Mm.
And then as an adult, I sort of look back on my um, staunch opposition to smoking as a little bit of, coming from a place of not really understanding what they were going through. So all these women really struggled, and smoking was one of the one things that they had control over. They could smoke as much as they wanted. No one was going to stop them. So yeah, I found that these rooms full of, because it was all women at bingo, these rooms full of women gambling and hating each other when someone else won, or it's just,
Yeah.
it was very dramatic and operatic in nature.
Yeah. And it's so interesting the way that you shape that poem, Bingo. You use the form of something like a bingo card.
Yes,
It's
yeah, no,
interesting to
that,
take form from that.
yeah, that was my yeah, I really wanted to do that, and I really fought for that in the publication of the book, that we should have that. But of course, you have to turn the book up, sideways in order to read it. But I think it's worthwhile.
Yeah, yeah. Initially, I read it on a computer, so I was trying to turn the computer around unsuccessfully. But yeah, there's a lot of tension throughout the book. I read something you wrote once where you said, "Whenever I get the feeling, like many other islanders do, that perhaps I should up and leave this place, Mary Dalton's voice tells me to go even closer to home instead and find myself again in Conception Bay." Again, we come back to themes of locale with Mary Dalton, Newfoundland, um, but also that tension of should I stay, should I go? I wonder if you could talk again a little bit about place, but going into the sense of tension with place.
So in Newfoundland specifically, and I'm sure it's like this in Ireland too, but we have such a history of outmigration, and
Yeah.
anyone who had the sense enough to leave did. And so it was
Mm.
this idea that everyone who stayed did so because they had no choice. So it was this sort of choicelessness of staying that I've been interested in, because we had no other options. I was born in Calgary, so my family got out. They got out, they went to Calgary, they started a life for themselves. But after I was born, my mother hated it there because she wasn't around her family. So, they moved back home and raised me in
Yeah.
Brigus. So they had the opportunity to have incomes and have jobs and have a life, but they gave it all up to come back to Newfoundland and have absolutely nothing. So I was very torn by that as a child. I often wondered why they did that, because we were so poor. Um, and it made no sense to me. Why would you stay? And then, of course, again, like a big theme in my writing is I thought one way as a child, and then when I was adult, I sort of realized how silly it was. So,
Mm.
Newfoundland has this extraordinary pull on you, and it's very hard to leave. And when you watch people leave, you miss them a lot, and you sort of wonder, well, when is it going to be my turn? And
Mm.
I think for me, like I'll probably die here. It's not, but I've certainly, yeah, I've really struggled with the idea of raising a family here in a place that sometimes feels like there's no opportunity.
Yeah. Is that where some of the art comes from in you, both as a musician as well as a writer, that sense of being torn?
Yeah, I had a lot of um, big feelings to process growing up and as an adult. And I turned to music as a way to express that, and writing. Like I started writing more seriously when I turned 20 or so. But as a child, my journals were full of poems, and I've always done it. My first poem I ever wrote was about being scared of a dog. It's there was a lot of danger
Mine
in.
too.
Well, it's funny. So I had, in the dark, a dog will bark and make the goosebumps raise. A kitty will meow and
Mm.
comfort them. How? Oh, in her soothing way. And I worked on that poem over and over and over again until I was happy with it. And I was in grade two. So yeah, no, it's playing, and also playing music. Going into classical music felt like a bit of a ticket out of here when I was a teenager. So I thought if I got good enough, maybe I could move to Toronto and have a job. So I had this idea of going to be, an operatic orchestral player. Like I wanted to play with the Canadian Opera Company. Um, that was my dream job. And then I got pregnant
Yeah,
and stayed here. So yeah, the
yeah,
escape was sort of taken away from me, even though that's definitely
mm,
what I wanted to do with it.
yeah. You reference plenty of musicians in the text of your poems, but I was curious whether the sound of music influences the way you make word choice as well.
Yeah, I definitely read. I read my poems out loud. I know not everybody does this, but I'm definitely a big you know, auditory editor. So I'll read something and see whether or not I like the sound of it, if it sounds musical or if it sounds a bit dead, and then try to find a different word to substitute or something like that. I'm always at that.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier on about the kind of relief and of freedom of perhaps being alone. I was struck in the second part of the book where there's lots of poems that have titles like cleaning out the freezer or cleaning out the fridge or cleaning out the sock drawer, how alone the speaker is. I wonder if you could read one or two of those poems, and then talk a little bit about that character who's involved in, you called it gendered, unpaid domestic labor. I think that's how you described it in one interview.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, okay, I'll read cleaning out the fridge and cleaning out the sock drawer. So cleaning out the fridge. Shelves weighed down with unnecessary bits of live sustained by convenience, stored turkey, dressing and gravy, sandwiches. Packets of tartar sauce resting in vegetable drawers, drowning in old cucumber juice. You are saucy enough, I hear Nan say, fishing them out. Ancient jars of pickled wieners from a time when my ex was trying new things, and I told him I would soon say, I told you so. My mouth puckers into a shape I remember from when flippers were cooked. The grossness of this Saturday chore too much for me. The jar whips out of my hand, breaks everything. I don't sweep it up. Glass will probably settle in my feet in pieces too small to feel anyway. Cleaning out the sock drawer. Always knew I wouldn't match socks, but I thought I'd at least have the discipline to bleach them, lay them out to sort, to place the unmatched in neat rows in a lined drawer. Thought I would sew scent into flowery satchels, would care to protect my underwear from staining, whiten my socks, my teeth, pluck unruly eyebrows. Turns out panty liners, eyebrow liners, drawer liners are luxury items I cannot afford to think about. Turns out I can't stomach the smell of bleach. So those two poems, really about sort of the failure that I felt of not being able to keep the fridge clean or to keep my clothes clean, and that those things would never have happened with my nans. It would have always been perfect.
Mm. There's such an anticipation of time in all of those as well. You know, I thought I'd be like this, but here it is. Here it is that I'm struggling. Is time a bully in that, or does time bring comfort?
I think it's a bit of both. I know when I was writing these poems, I was the only time I really had alone was when I was cleaning. I would be able to come up with the excuse of I need to clean the fridge out. You need to take the children out of the house so I can do it because they are going to get in the way. So I wrote about that sort of feeling of there's never enough time to do anything, and yeah, by the time you're sort of done doing the chore, you have used up all your alone time for the week or whatever it is, and so time definitely a bully in that sense, but also the relief of I still have time to figure this out, plays into some of the later ones. But yeah, in these the
Okay.
cleaning outs and the
Mm.
emptying outs, these poems they're very much felt like sort of things were over, and I had to accept that I was stuck here in this repetition of doing these awful chores.
Mm. Yeah. The word floor occurs a number of times throughout the book too. I thought that was a very interesting thing. You know, in Bingo, there's I crawled around the floor of the hall foraging for change. There's economics showing up there. Slipping on the wet floor is in the poem Bad Date. And then in Wiping Down the Counters, there's a line, rest here on the kitchen floor a while. So there's tiredness, there's escape, there's economics happening on the floor. I was curious about how the floor kind of shows up as a character throughout these poems.
Yeah, I definitely inspired a lot of the time through in my writing by movies and you know, the horror movie often has this like crawling along the floor to escape. You know, you're dragging yourself forward one more step until you get to the door, you know, to get out of the house. I used to have a band called Door Lock, with the idea of the door. So I think about the meeting place between wall and floor as being a like the sort of, it's at once hopeful and terrifying to be sort of stuck in a room or stuck on the floor. Um, but yeah, the relief of lying down at the end of a long day, or doing yoga on the floor, you know, there's also a lot of happiness there,
Yeah.
you know. Yeah.
Yeah, there's rest and relief in the macabre. You described once the dark underbelly of the domestic sphere, but then there's also great joy in erotics throughout the book too. Again, that tension. I'm curious what you're working on now in terms of your writing.
I'm working on a book of poems about the sort of the threat of desire, of feeling something that you want that perhaps you shouldn't want, or um, that would require your life to change in a certain way. You know, I think a lot about sort of queer poetics these days. You know, like I'm getting married in July to a man, but you know I'm a bisexual woman. I think about women all the time, but I'm about to get married. You know, and so this very personal moment in my life has inspired a lot of thinking about all the opportunities that I'll miss out on, or all the things in the past that I could have done differently. And yeah, so I'm writing, they're pretty sad poems. I'm also
Oh,
writing a set of poems about being in an orchestra, and feeling that the sort of power of being one of 100 musicians, you know, banging out a Beethoven symphony or something like that. So, and I've just wrote a book of short fiction, so I'm looking forward to exploring, and they're all the same sort of thing, you know, domesticity and relationships, and coercive controls plays a big part in my fiction writing. So yeah, another book very much centered in St. John's this time, as opposed to in rural Newfoundland. And yeah, I've left the bay behind a little bit in my writing lately. So
going to the city. Maggie Burton, author of Chores, Griffin Prize winner for 2024 for first Canadian book. Thank you very much for your time. It's been a pleasure
thank
to
you,
meet you.
thank you.